Next, we sit down with William Norwood, author of Cleared for Takeoff, a pilot's story of challenges and triumph. Mr. Norwood, the first African-American pilot for United Airlines, recounts his early life in segregated Centralia, to his days at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale as the school's first African-American quarterback, and his time spent flying B-52s carrying nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mr. Norwood explains how he overcame adversity to achieve his dreams and how today's youth can do the same. This runs about 30 minutes.
On behalf of the Illinois Channel, I am pleased today to have Bill Norwood with us, who has just penned a book about his life. It's called Cleared for Takeoff, and thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Happy to have you here. Let's start out with, you were born in Centralia, Illinois, back in the 1930s. Back then, the town was segregated. Your elementary school principal served as a mentor to you. Mr. Walker, I believe is his name.
Yes.
And would you like to talk about him a little bit for me?
Yes, I met Mr. Walker when I was in the 7th grade. He came as principal for Lincoln Elementary School, which was all African-American school. And prior to his coming there, we were a little bit rambunctious. So when he came, he set a few rules in place that said, I want you to act like students. And at the time, he and his wife were married, but they had no children. So when he got there and started being a little bit more stringent with us, but he also played basketball with us, played softball with us, and I just admired him. He was a Tuskegee Airman, and he loved flying. So he kind of took me under his wing, and he took me fishing, took me hunting a few times, and like anyone else, your parents tell you something, but when you look at someone that you admire, you listen a little bit more closely. So I started to listen to him and think more and more of him. And it was interesting because he also taught the math and science and some English classes. And when we wanted to divert him from the classroom, we would talk about airplanes. And he would be diverted for about 3 or 4 minutes, and he'd get right back to the lesson then. So.
But really, his stories that you would talk about on your trips fishing, and he really kind of mentored you. You really would get excited and really kind of wanted to become a pilot, I think, because of him and his history, and as a Tuskegee Airman and all of his stories that he would tell you. I think that it really kind of brought you to a level of understanding on how exciting it would be to be a pilot.
That's true. I really wanted to be a doctor. And I had the academic skills to become a doctor, but my folks didn't have financial wherewithal for me to go to medical school and wasn't aware of any scholarships or anything, so I kind of gave up on the idea of becoming a doctor. And then when I started talking about aviation, I started to get a little bit more interested in the idea of aviation. And we did have one African American who owned an airplane, a small airplane in Centralia, but I didn't want to go up with him. He didn't seem like he would be the most responsible person in the world, so I didn't fly with him at all.
Now moving on to high school. In Centralia, the high school was integrated.
Yes.
And so that was probably a lot of a different experience for you, given the fact that your elementary school days, that was a segregated school, all African American. And high school, it proved to be a little bit of a challenge, not to you on the academic side or sports side, but just the integration and certain thoughts of certain individuals, teachers, so on and so forth. Can you embellish a little bit on high school life?
Well, basically at elementary school, it was a very proud group of teachers. And the one thing they did is that they were very, very strict on you being a good student, because we went to the integrated high school and they wanted us to represent Lincoln Elementary very, very well. And we had outstanding teachers, and lo and behold, I can name every one of my teachers in every grade they taught. So it's kind of in the African American community, the attitude was, when you go out in public, you represent the family. And so we went to the high school, we were representing our school. And we wanted to be sure that we represented them well. And the teachers out there, once they found out you could do the work, they weren't that much of a problem. Of course, everyone at the high school was white, including the janitor.
Now, in the book, it goes a little more into this, but you started dating and became friends and started dating, and it was in an interracial relationship. Mm-hmm. And there were 4 of you that were asked to leave school for a year. Mm-hmm. How did that impact you psychologically?
Well, we knew the rules. The rules were against it, but you know, we get adventurous sometimes, and it was more than 4 of us involved in it. There were probably about 10 or 12. And what happened is that when you're on the point of the spear and you're not the most popular kid in the class, you're not a basketball player, they don't need you to play next year. I was one of the ones that was caught, and I knew what it was wrong. I didn't think it would be as strict or as severe, but we were asked to leave school. And what they thought is that the 4 of us, if we left school, 2 African American males, 2 Caucasian females, that they were through with us and we would be gone forever. However, when we volunteered after being asked, since my folks didn't have an in with the attorneys, we didn't have resources, we didn't know anyone on the school board, it was pretty much a fait accompli that we would obey what the ruling was. And they thought they were through with us. What happened, though, is that I was supported by the community. I was supported by my church. People encouraged me. I knew that I could not stay at home and do nothing, so I got a job and saved my money and said, okay, this is one of those things where you make a decision. Are you going to give in and give up, or are you going back and try to be stronger? And it actually worked to my benefit because I was not a great athlete. So being a year older, I was a little bit stronger, I was a little bit more determined, and a lot more focused. So it did work well for me in the end.
And it's a pretty extreme punishment, if you will, I thought. But one of the individuals that kept encouraging you, and I think you were the only one out of the 4 that actually went back to school, was Roland Burris, who you also grew up with. And just for the viewers' sake, Roland Burris was the first African-American statewide elected office holder in Illinois as comptroller and then went on to be Attorney General. So I find that a fascinating, you know, he kind of encouraged you to get involved in sports and go back, even though, you know, I'm sure it would have been extremely disappointing that really, even though it was a rule, logically speaking, it's unfortunate that we even had that type of thought process. But life skills are learned, and I think that, you know, your determination is key, and really throughout the entire book. Your confidence level really never waned because I think that you had so much belief in yourself, your skills, and your forward thinking that really is a constant, I think, in your personality. Moving on to college. So high school, you did very well academically, and moving on to Southern Illinois University. And talk a little about how exciting that was.
That was really a pleasant, very pleasant experience. But whenever you go into anything new, there's always some caution. There's always some, can I do it? Now, I knew I could handle it academically because in high school in Centralia, we had a college prep program, which meant 4 years of science, 4 years of math, 4 years of English, 4 years of social studies, 2 years of foreign language. And I completed that very well. So I had no problem with worrying about the academics. The big thing is I was on a football scholarship, and since most people don't understand, when you get a scholarship to a university for 4 years, you commit for 4 years, they commit to you for year to year. So I got there and started playing football, and it was interesting because when you're a freshman, and freshmen could play varsity at that time, you kind of cannon fodder. So I was playing cornerback one time, and this guy came around the end. He weighed about 185, I weighed 135, and he knocked me out. And I said to myself, if I had money, I'd quit this game today. But that was my way of getting an education.
And that's fantastic. And you were actually the first African-American quarterback at Southern Illinois University.
That's correct, yeah. And at that time, predominantly white schools did not have African American quarterbacks that I knew of. So it was a new thing, and that was some navigating to get that done, because I started running first string quarterback my freshman year, getting ready for my sophomore year, and this one coach, who I didn't think was fair, came up to me and said, "Well, Bill, you know, you have such speed," which was a lie. "You are so shifty," which is a lie, that you should be a flanker back. And I would have gone to flanker simply because I wanted to get an education. But my backfield coach, his name was Carmen Picone, he was Italian, and he came up to me and hugged me and put his arm around his shoulder. We were always very close. He said, "Bill, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what he's trying to do." He said, "But what you have to do is that I'm the coach. I'm the backfield coach. You're my quarterback. And if you don't be my quarterback, I'll take your scholarship." So that gave me the impetus to stay as a quarterback. And also I worked hard at it. When I was in high school, I only threw 4 passes my senior year. When I got to college, I was expected to throw a lot of passes. And Jerry Hart, who was the first string quarterback, taught me to throw correctly. And I started practicing, started throwing footballs every day except Sunday. Sunday's church day in the African American community when I was growing up. And no way was I going to throw footballs on Sunday. And I always said that the youngsters who were catching those balls, who were 12, 13 years old, and I was knocking them down, I said when I graduated, their name should be on my diploma instead of mine.
Now, during college, you also joined the Air Force ROTC, is that correct?
That's correct.
And talk to me a little bit about those days. That would have had to be pretty exciting.
Well, it was exciting because the first 2 years were mandatory. And we had to wear that uniform on Tuesday and Thursday and March. And most people jumped out of that uniform. I didn't have a lot of clothes, so I wore my uniform all day Thursday and all day Tuesday, and that saved me having other clothes. But when I decided to go in advanced ROTC for the last 2 years, and that way if you graduated well and you were accepted in the Air Force, you went in as an officer, and they gave us stylized, custom-made gabardine uniforms, so I was excited. So I went on advanced ROTC, and also in advanced ROTC, if you were going into pilot training, the government paid for 36 hours of flight training.
Fantastic. And you excelled. You did very well in this area, and really I think a lot of what I gather from reading the book is that you kind of had to try harder than other folks on a lot of different levels.
Well, the amazing thing, which I think is still a good thing to teach students today, and I was talking to high schoolers today and told them the same thing. When we grew up, knowing that it was segregated, knowing there was discrimination, not only against people of color, but against women, we were taught you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. So this stuck with me, and when I got into flying, and also I told them today that I formed a habit, and I had formed this in classes also, that whenever I had a class or had a flight, as soon as the flight was over, I didn't wait till night to study. I studied then, when it was fresh. And I also would write down what I did well and what I did poorly. And next time I went out for flight training, I would review everything, and it was fresh. So it was interesting because the instructor I had, his name was Glenn Sheets, and a friend of mine had him the year before, and he said, "Well, you don't want to go with Glenn Sheets, he's so prejudiced." And I've always said, I'll make my own conclusion as to what kind of person it is. And I went out, and Glenn Sheets wasn't prejudiced, he's just mean. He wanted you to fly a certain way, and as long as you did that, he was happy with you. So he taught me well, and I did excel. I'm not bragging, but I soloed in 5.5 hours, which was the record then, and I think it's still a record at the university. And I got a private license. I took my private license check ride at 31 hours, and in 33 hours I had my private license. But it wasn't because I was so much better than anyone, but it was just I worked harder. And that's what I try to tell students, is that sometimes someone might have more talent than you, but you can always outwork them.
It's a good philosophy to live by. And your training took you to various bases, Alabama, Texas, California, and all of which had its own, let's say, culture and feeling to it. Can you tell a couple stories, maybe from Texas and Alabama, and how they differed?
When I went to Texas, southeastern Texas, when I was picked the base, or the base picked me, there was an African-American flight surgeon said, you know, Lieutenant, you don't want to go down there because they don't graduate African-Americans down there. And I've always been a little stubborn, not too bright, but a little stubborn. I said, I'll go down there. So I went down to southeastern Texas, and true enough, one of my friends who had graduated with me, he was down there. We were the only two African-Americans down there in this training. And they had a thing where they said if you flunked 2 exams, and we had at least a written exam every week for 6 months. Passing was 78. If you flunked it, you could go up for review. This other African-American youngster had a 77 on one exam. And about a month before graduation, he made a 76. He was gone the next day. The next day he was gone. Now, one of my important check rides came up. And I went over to operations that morning. I have a spit shine, my shoes were shine. I was in a nice uniform. And I sat down waiting for the check pilot to come. And as you've said, and I agree, if you're 15 minutes early, you're on time. So I was 30 minutes early. And I was sitting there, and a young woman who was Mexican, we were close to the border, and she worked in the office. And when you're the sole minority, you know, person of color or woman, everybody knows you. So we sat down, and she said, "You getting a check ride today?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Who is it with?" I said, "I don't know." So this check pilot comes in, and he's a big man. He's like 6'4" and very strong looking. And it was a check pilot named Archie Belvin. And down in there, everyone has a call sign. His call sign was Honcho 13 or Honcho 13. And people feared him. So when he came up, I jumped up and saluted it. And lo and behold, I just found out that of the last 14 people he had given a check ride, he had flunked 13, and all of them were white. So I said, you know, this is going to be a serious check ride.
Now, for the viewers, explain what a check ride is.
A check ride is basically you have them all the way through training, and you have them also when you're with the airlines. You have proficiency check rides, and what they're doing is see how you are coming along at different stages of your training. It's like an exam in math. You know, you study the Pythagorean theorem, and you get there, and they have a test. You know, how have you done on this Pythagorean theorem? This is the same thing with check rides. You have different phases of checks during your training. Some are more important than others. You'll have a check ride to see when you can solo. You'll have a check rides when you transition to a new airplane. The check ride I was having was after I was in the airplane about 45 hours. So they're just checking on your level of skill. And it goes through the airlines, yeah.
Let's jump to 1963. You were flying, you were a pilot. The country was going through a pretty scary time, Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
Talked a little bit about your cargo.
Oh, my cargo during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And most people during that period, and surely today, have no concept of how serious that time was. The cargo we were carrying, we were flying 24-hour airborne alert. Cargo we were carrying were nuclear weapons. And we had 6 of them, and we had targets into Russia, and we had escape plans for our families in case attack came. And remember, that was during the time where they told Russia to get the missiles out of Cuba. And most people don't know how close we came to having a conflagration.
And your crew and you were so important. Was this on the B-52?
This is on the B-52, yes.
And that really you could have been anywhere. And if you got the call, literally, you were escorted and your entire crew to the plane, if need be, as soon as possible.
That was true if we were on the ground, okay, because we were in an alert facility. And with the klaxon, which was a loud bell, if that went off, you went and jumped in the airplane and got ready to go. But now on airborne alert, which I was flying, we had targets, and if the bell rang, we would go to our target and stop dropping stuff, and that was scary.
Yes,
You
that
know.
would be very scary.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine during that time frame. And you know, in our country, the aviation world really changed after, of course, 9/11. What would you say? I mean, that experience alone, which would, I think, be terrifying. You think, wow, we could really genuinely be on the brink of war. What advice would you give someone today that would want to become a pilot in the military or otherwise?
The first thing I would say is that if you want to be a pilot, be one, because it's a passion, and it's not like any other field. We often said that we would fly airplanes for free. We didn't tell the company that, but we enjoyed it that much. And I encourage everyone who has an inkling that they would like to learn to fly, take some lessons. Because the one thing you'll never forget is the first day you solo. Now, my wife is soloed, and I have 24,000 hours of flying time, and I can still see my solo. I can tell you what the conversation was between Glenn and me and everything else. I mean, it just stays with you. And if you have the idea that you would like to try to learn to fly, I would do it. Tell people, take money you would spend on a vacation and learn to fly.
And I like to fly. Obviously, I've never piloted an airplane. I did, however, I recall in your garage, your simulator, that I did try to fly and I crashed. So I don't think probably I'm the best candidate to be, but it's certainly very freeing, and you do talk a lot about your first solo. You also talk about the decision to leave the Air Force and go work for a commercial airline, which happened to be United Airlines, that hired you. And talk a little bit about your first flight as a pilot for United Airlines. It's pretty exciting.
It was exciting. Well, number one, before I came to United, the word that this very highly skilled, intelligent gentleman was coming to fly, who happened to be African American, fly for the airlines, and some people said, well, we're going to quit if that happens. Well, you know, they're not going to quit a job like that. But anyway, my first flight, I flew from Chicago to Cleveland. And when I got to Cleveland, there were sky caps waiting for me, because they knew what the historical importance of me being a pilot at United was, something they thought they would never see. And some of them had been off work for 3 hours, and they were waiting for me there.
They waited for you.
Yes.
And that would be very emotional, I can imagine.
It is emotional, yes, it really is.
And very exciting. So as the first African-American pilot for United, I mean, I would think that would bring a lot of responsibility. Just for, you know, anyone who wanted to come after that and had a dream. I mean, for the Skycaps to, you know, they've been off work and they're probably tired and want to go home, but they knew the significance of that and they waited to meet you. I can imagine that would stay with you forever as well.
Oh, yes.
And here you are, you're a pilot, you and your beautiful wife Molly and your 2 children. You're now located up by O'Hare. You're an airplane pilot, you've got a good job, things are going well. You can't find a place to live.
True.
So in Hinsdale, located in DuPage County, primarily, you looked to find a home for your family and couldn't because they didn't want to rent or sell to African American families. How frustrating was that?
Very frustrating, very frustrating. Because we had just come from church, the boys had their suits on, we were dressed well. And we went out to Hinsdale and went into this place that's building houses. So we went in and asked the person who was in charge, if we picked out a lot and picked out a house that we wanted, about when do you think it would be ready? And this person said, well, I really don't know. I said, it's Sunday. You sell more houses on Sunday than you do any time. You mean to tell me that you can't say to us when this house will be ready? And what happened when we walked in there were probably 15 white people in there looking at houses, and the water split like the Nile or the Jordan when we walked in, but none of them left. They stayed in there. And we continued to talk to this man. I said, well, is it that you don't want African Americans out here? He said, well, I don't own the place, but I think that's what they want. I said, well, as I recall in looking at some of the literature, you have federal money in this project. And if federal money is in it, if I want a house, you have to sell me a house. Is that true? He said, well, yep, that's true. I said, well, we'll look at your models. But where are the people coming from that are moving out here? And they have the little red dots on the thing. They were coming from Cicero and Berwyn, which in Chicago is some of the most segregated and racist areas, in the area. And when you are embarrassed in front of your family, it is not nice. So I politely said, we'll go look at your models, but I wouldn't move out here if you paid me, simply because the type of people you're attracting are not in our class as far as finances, education, experiences, travel, or culture. And you could hear the proverbial rat on cotton when that came out. But I was upset. And sometimes when you get upset, you can't show that you're upset. But for these people standing there and staying there to watch us in the process of getting a home or trying to get a home was upsetting.
Of course, that would be upsetting. And so you ventured out and found a lovely area, Elk Grove Village, and you and Molly and the family lived there for 20 years?
We lived in Elk Grove for 13 years until the boys finished high school. And then we lived in Rolling Meadows for 15 years. Then we moved back, after a year before I retired, we moved back to Carbondale, Illinois. Stayed there 15 years.
Yes. So how important was it to you to have your son call you in that you were cleared for landing on your last flight with United
It was very
Airlines?
important. Important and emotional. So he cleared me for landing, and they kind of put a little box around me so I didn't have to have any delay or anything. And it was interesting because when I came in about 35 miles from Southeast O'Hare, everybody's saying it's been nice working with you and everything. And they said, would you like to make a trip around the holding pattern just for old time's sake? I said, no, I've done that enough, but thanks. And so when I was coming in, they cleared me on runway 27 right. Well, there were about 100 people, I didn't know it, waiting in the terminal to greet us. And 27 right is the shortest runway they had at that time. So I said, what about 32 left, 27 left? The wind was at 320 at 8 knots. They said, the airport's yours. Use any you want. So there was a Continental airplane taking off on an intersecting runway. And our son said, Continental will clear your takeoff, but get out of the way because I'm not sending my dad around on his final flight. And then he said, everybody, on 27 left, salute my dad. And I said to the tower, I said, you all are grading this landing. They say, every one of us is grading it. And I will say, not bragging or anything like that, it was a grease job. And we have it on film, so. And
after a very successful career with United, and there's some great stories, of course, in the book. I won't say everything that's in there. We want to get sales up. But anyway, your last landing, very important. A lot of family on the plane, and obviously a lot of people waiting for you there. So much so, it was so landmark that the plane that you actually flew, I believe, 4 times, was it a 747 or
727?
727 now hangs in the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry.
Yes, it does.
With Captain Bill Norwood painted on it. Now, talk about the process of getting the plane into the museum.
Well, number one is 727 that they landed at Meigs Field. Meigs Field is not a field that was, when it was still in one piece, is not a field that you bring airliners in. But they made it light. I was not on the air, I didn't fly it into Meigs because I was flying DC-10 at that time, and we don't fly 2 different airplanes at the same time. But they got it light, fuel load, and landed it with max landing flaps and got it in there. Then they took the airplane and put it on a barge, took it to the Gary Harbor, sat for 2 or 3 days till the Lake Michigan got calm in that area. They towed it over to the Museum of Science and Industry. They closed Lakeshore Drive to pull it across. They took the wings off the airplane, They took the engines off the airplane, the tail off the airplane, and took one column out of the Museum of Science and Industry to pull it in there, and then they reassembled it in there. But it's a tremendous honor.
Tremendous honor. And you have many other accomplishments that you've achieved, awards throughout your career and life. And to go through them all would take us another half an hour. You must be very proud of your career, and I know that your family is. And what advice would you give someone that maybe was teetering on giving up hope if they had a dream and getting frustrated? You know, we'd like to think that we've come a long way in this country in terms of racial relations, but you look at things that are going on in Ferguson, Missouri, and things of that nature, and it kind of sometimes feels that 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. What advice would you give a young African American person today that might be having a little bit of a hard time, at whether they live in an area where it's not exactly easy for them to get a quality education or so on and so forth? What advice would you give to them?
I would give it to people of color and also give it to women. Never give up. Keep knocking at the door. Never let someone define who you are or how good you are. You can be as excellent as you want to, and there will be people tugging at you to pull you down. But the only reason they're trying to pull you down is because you're above them. And if you just keep trying, stay focused, persevere, it'll work out.
That's fantastic advice. You and your wife Molly travel a lot. You've been literally all over the world. And I was trying to think of an appropriate last question to ask you. And you've done so much in your life. You've had so many amazing achievements. And one of my favorite shows, it's no longer on the air, was called The West Wing. And a fictional character, Martin Sheen, played the President of the United States. And throughout all of the seasons of that show, he would always look at his staff and say, okay, what's next? So, what's next?
What's next for us? We're just enjoying being married for 54 years and taking advantage of the travel, enjoying the grandchildren, and trying to motivate the youngsters.
Wonderful. And you and Molly have both been extraordinary mentors. Talk a little bit about, the many benefits. You have a scholarship fund. You do quite a bit to help youth. If you would just briefly speak about those.
Well, we try to give back because so much has been given to us, and we've on so many people's shoulders. We have a scholarship fund for the community college in Southern Illinois in honor of my mother-in-law and father-in-law. We have a scholarship fund right now that we give to students who are in aviation to help them. That's at Southern Illinois University. We have another at Southern Illinois University that we give to med prep students. And we're working on, in this particular book that we're talking about right now, we're using the proceeds to give to the scholarships and also to support the Tuskegee Airmen local chapter in Arizona.
Thank you so much, Bill, for being here today. I hope the viewers have enjoyed this interview as much as I did. And again, the book is Cleared for Takeoff by William Norwood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie.